Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
And today, on our 5-year anniversary, we are having a guest join us to talk about advanced data protection with Microsoft. So, Amren, if you can give a quick introduction about yourself and, like what you're doing, where you came from, what qualifies you to be the expert on data protection that we bring in, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I didn't realize it was your 5th anniversary. I feel honored to be a special guest. But yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm Amren Gill. I'm a data security solutions engineer. Now we're rebranding from compliance to technical specialist before, but it basically means that I go very deep into all things Microsoft Purview, right? From a data security perspective. My background is a blend of data protection, e-discovery, records management. If you go back far enough, there's digital forensics as well. I came from the partner world before, a ton of experience like operationalizing Purview technology, but now more on the sales side. But yeah, obviously Andy and I used to work together before. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So I just love how the two people we've had for data security are both Brits. And so it's apparently the British are very good at data security over there.
There's one very specific area within the UK as well. It's very good. Clearly.
Yeah. So, Adam, if you want to do our quick disclaimer, because all three of us all work for Microsoft, and so this is not a Microsoft podcast, but
yeah, let's do it real quick. So, hey, we all three work for Microsoft. We're all in our field security sales. However, we are recording this on a Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Central Time, 8 a.m. Pacific Time, where Amren's at. So we're doing this show on our own time and on our own dime. So Andy and I self-fund the show, our recording platform, our domains, all of the tools we use, all come from our own pockets. So Microsoft is not directly involved in this show. However, we do want listeners to be aware there's potential conflict of interest where we do work. We're, of course, wanting to stay in the good graces of our employer and stay gainfully employed. So that may color some of our conversation, but do understand we do try to come at all of this through an academic lens. We want to state facts and figures and verifiable information, and we'll leave the decision-making and opinion forming up to you. Although, if you've listened to this show long enough, you know I will drop an opinion or two from time to time, as I'm known to do. With that said, let's get on with the show.
All right. Yeah. So data security is something that Adam and I generally do not have a ton of deep expertise in, because it's not something that we had covered in our careers. But obviously we know the basics, but we do want to go over them for people maybe who are starting out in data security, looking at information protection, looking at the boom of AI and where do they get started. And so if we're starting from scratch and we're looking at the basic tools that are included with Purview, how do you kind of go with customers and recommend that they get started? Like, where's a good starting point if they have no idea what to do?
Yeah, and this was a really prominent conversation maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, where it was data security was less in the limelight because AI emergence hadn't happened yet, and it was focused around security. So 2 or 3 years ago, we were having a conversation around the fundamentals around understanding what data you have first. And there are tools that kind of do that automatically in Purview. And I think the starting point is really what we call data classification, right? That's the fundamental building blocks of understanding, scanning, identifying where sensitive content is within a customer's environment. The data classification piece is, with the basic capabilities, is what we call sensitive information types. These are the building blocks of identification of sensitive content in live, right? There's things like known PII, things like social security numbers, credit card numbers, known patterns of information that are automatically identified when content is indexed in M365, right? So for example, if a user saves a file to SharePoint or OneDrive, or if they send an email, the data classification system service automatically scans all of that data for where sensitive data may exist. So the likelihood is that they're further along than they think they are because of the fact that we do this automatically. And then they can just use that for reference and saying, okay, the scanning has taken place. Now I can go and look at where that sensitive data exists, right? So the starting point would be leveraging the data classification to understand what data they have. And then, of course, they can build their own classifiers, right? So they can identify whether there are gaps maybe in the out-of-the-box solutions. We have about 300 plus sensitive information types by default that typically hit on the more common PII types. But then using things like regular expressions and keywords, they can build their own, right, to plug those gaps of specifically what data they want to find. That's kind of the starting point, understanding what data they have before going into like the protection and the risk mitigation piece.
So this isn't something that they have to turn on. It's just automatically doing it.
Right. Yeah. So for all new data, as soon as it's uploaded anywhere and it's indexed, the data classification service will scan it and identify it. It's like on the back end, it will tag it as, this is a file that contains a social security number, for example, and it's not visible to users, but then it's recognizable by the system to say, okay, now we can implement controls like implement data loss prevention or auto labeling or other controls that use the content.
How good is the service at identifying these sensitive information types? Is there a way to see if you can adjust it, if there's false positives, like how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it will largely work on what is defined as trying to identify, right? So for example, if you build a custom information type, which is using a regular expression, and you build X amount of validation into your regular expression, it's going to search and try and find hits based on what you've configured. What you can do is set different confidence levels. So for example, you can say these regular expressions try and find this pattern of information, but there's less validation, so we can say it's a low confidence. But as you build further validation into those regular expressions or add more keywords to narrow down the scope, you can say that this is a higher confidence and then use that to reduce false positives with your policies downstream.
Gotcha.
So for example, like with credit card numbers, I know this, Amren, obviously that's typically a 16 or 15 digit number, but then there's also keywords we usually look for with it. We're going to look for Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express. We're going to look for expiration dates that usually have a specific format. We're going to look for CVV or CVV2. And when you increase that confidence with those kinds of detections, with those sensitive information types, it closes the gap allowed between the distance between, hey, I think this is a credit card number. How many characters away can expiration be for it to match or not? As like a really simple example for our listeners to understand, when you're increasing confidence, what does it do? It demands to see these things versus if you lower confidence, it may detect it even if the word Visa, Discover, MasterCard never appears in the same document. It may still say, well, this is 16. It has all the checksums. It meets the format. This is probably a credit card number, but it's lower confidence because you haven't looked for those additional verification, validation type information that you would secondarily look for to validate it.
Yeah, and we've built so much validation into our default information types. For example, like credit card numbers, the Lund check, they're a very specific set of criteria that can hit on a credit card, and we've built those into like the high confidence levels. So things like credit card numbers, social security numbers, the high confidence are very accurate because of those additional checks that we've learned over time and rolled out with our default information types.
Great. Okay. So then after you have a map of all your data and where it sits and you're looking at these sensitive information types, we want to move to protecting that data. And so how do organizations start? I mean, it's almost like an elephant, right? Because there's just I'm guessing that when you start looking at your sensitive information and the scans, that it's just going to be probably overwhelming how much you have. And so where do they get started on protecting that data estate there?
Yeah, the likelihood is that most enterprise organizations have so much data that it is a daunting feat to look at that and say, well, this is how much sensitive data we have across the environment, right? So it's funny because when you go back to the previous time you spoke about this, the likelihood is that everything was very different with what Microsoft was recommending. We used to have this concept of keep labels very simple, don't encrypt by default. You want to keep everything really simple. We're just going to start rolling this out. And we used to have this crawl, walk, run approach. We've almost moved away from that approach with what we're recommending, in the sense that largely with the Secure Future initiative in mind, right? This huge initiative to just raise the levels of security of everything in Microsoft and all of our products, whereby we're recommending secure by default now, right? So absolutely starts with building some label taxonomy of some sort, right? Because sensitivity labels really play the key role in the data protection piece. They apply markings, access control, right, which we call encryption with sensitivity labels. So we talk about protecting the data, like data at rest or as it's created. That's done with what we call sensitivity labels, which maps to the product in Microsoft Purview called information protection, formerly known as AIP. People who probably know that like legacy name. Obviously, we'll have to change the names of everything as much as we can. But yeah, those sensitivity labels is what is applying that protection to the data itself. So yeah, the recommendation is secure by default. So at Microsoft, we went through massive changes recently where we moved this encrypted by default. And we used to have this mindset where you don't want to disrupt business continuity and you want to have as little impact on users as possible, which is true, but that's at the concession of security. So now we've changed this mindset around, okay, there may be a small speed bump in terms of like the productivity for users, but we're ensuring that security first. So we have unencrypted emails by default, but you still have a default label, and then encrypted files and sites by default, right? So then you have that secure by default, and then the exceptions, you start going to like user exceptions. So there's really good published recommendations in terms of this default label approach, and then you kind of move through the different stages to get like that optimized state, which is what we're recommending. But it starts with deploying labels, having encryption by default, and then training users on exceptions or where they need to downgrade labels potentially.
Customers always get wound up around all their backlog of data, their existing data, their archive data. And a lot of times they come with a mindset of focused on that first, of how do I go retroactively apply to all that? And Amren, I'm curious if this guidance is still the same, because I was formerly an identity and information protection technical specialist many years ago now, but did sell information protection as my job. And our guidance was, you're going to create more data in the next year than you probably created in the previous 5 combined, because data is like an exponential growth phenomenon. Every organization is creating exponentially more data than they did the year before and the year before that. So our guidance always was, start by looking forward, draw that line in the sand, and start protecting the data today that you're creating today moving forward. The archive of data will be there, and we have ways to address that, and we can talk about that. But for the biggest bang for your buck, the easiest way to start is actually start looking forward and start protecting, classifying, labeling data today. Is that still the same guidance of that look forward first and then look backwards approach, or has that guidance changed as well?
Yeah, absolutely, Adam. Spot on. Still the case. And the reason for that is just because of the feasibility to go back and protect everything that exists, because the likelihood is you have terabytes, sometimes petabytes of data that it's just not feasible to go back and try and label everything, particularly if there are some system limits with how many files that can be labeled in a day. So absolutely is the case of draw a line in the sand, ensure what's created from now going forward is protected, and then you can build perimeter defense, right, for that existing data. So just because it's existing and it's not protected at rest doesn't mean that you can't protect it when it's moved or copied or shared, for example. So that's when we start getting into the data loss prevention controls. But absolutely, from a protection standpoint, what you have now going forward, then also what we have 200,000 employees, 700,000 plus guests in our account. We have so much data that the likelihood is we can't go back and label everything. It just wouldn't be done in time. So we work on the mindset of we invite people into our environment, but we protect not at the file, just at the file level, but the container level as well, right? So we can apply protections to the site so that we can control how, for example, when users do access that site, how if them, for example, like we can, if them from an unmanaged device or they're a guest user, they have restricted access because every file within that container, that site, they have this level of access. So that becomes easier as well when you start looking at a container level rather than just an item level as well. Right? So it's a combination of the two.
It's really interesting. I didn't realize that we went to that, secure by default, because I actually experienced it this week when I was putting together a deck for a presentation at a conference that I'm giving, and I had to upload a copy of the deck, and they couldn't access it. And I was like, oh, it's automatically labeled as confidential, internal employee. And I shared it a bunch of different ways. And so this is also, I think you mentioned it, it's important to build in a good exception process. I was able to easily downgrade the label, and put in a reason for it without any type of IT interaction. And of course, those are all auditable and everything. But it was very easy for me to just, because it was publicly accessible information that I put into the deck, it wasn't anything Microsoft internal. I just went ahead and downgraded the label to public, and that allowed me to share the deck, and they were able to see it. So with most of the things that we talked about here, I just wanted to make sure before we get into the more advanced stuff that when we talk about labeling, when you start off, it is mostly manual labeling, correct? The automatic stuff comes in with the higher licensing levels in the Microsoft suite. And so you mentioned DLP. So once you have like some standard labels, protection applied, and users can start to apply these labels, how does DLP, which is data loss protection, how does that work into it? Because if it's already encrypted, then we don't have to worry about it, right? So yeah, that was a facetious question.
Yeah, for sure. And the reason that we kind of go through that in that order is because there's a generally logical flow to how you should operationalize this technology. It works by understanding the data first, then applying the protection, and then applying data loss, or that layered security. So in that scenario you went through, Andy, it's if it's encrypted, then it's fine, right? It's why do we have to put data loss prevention? The reason is because the likelihood is that, well, defense in depth is always the best approach, right? Where there may be gaps, you want to mitigate those gaps as much as possible by having some perimeter defense, whereby you're not just saying, okay, if a document has an internal label applied, prevent that from being sent to external, like highly confidential, prevent that from being sent to external recipients, but not just on label, but on content as well. So the reason that we implement classification and then labels first is because we can use those classifiers as well as our labels with DLP. So we can build rules that say, yes, we don't want internal and highly confidential data to be sent externally, but also if the content contains social security numbers or credit card numbers or sensitive data, even if it's not labeled, we still want to apply controls because maybe it should be labeled and it's been mislabeled or just hasn't been labeled yet because it, see that that archive data, Adam, that you're talking about, we can still build those controls that say, evaluate this data at point of transmission. If it's not labeled or it's sensitive enough to meet these criteria, then I want to apply these controls, right? So DLP is obviously often seen as that last line of defense. So you want to make sure that you have controls in place beforehand, but also building that layered defense in depth with those perimeter controls.
Now, once you have your labels and DLP, I think, Adam brought up the large amount of data that people have. And oftentimes it's like, I will tell customers, if you don't need it, get rid of it, right? Because if it's just sitting there, I think people have this like hoarding mentality when it comes to data, and they're afraid to lose a bunch of stuff. But I think not only are some organizations governed that they have to, get rid of data, but it's also, I think, a good practice, like stuff that was unencrypted and from 20 years ago, you probably don't need anymore, right? And so what are some tools that the Microsoft suite has as far as like governing that data and the lifetime of that data?
Yeah, and you're going through this perfectly. We used to have this graphic, which was like 4 circles, and there was an arrow that moved around them, which was know your data, protect your data, prevent data loss, and then it was govern your data, right? And that last piece is around like managing the life cycle of that data, not just from a regulatory standpoint and disposal of stale data because of the risk that they're carried if you have sensitive and stale data, but especially now with the emergence of AI, the quality of data that AI is using, like generative AI, if it's outdated and old, then it's going to affect the quality of the output of the AI that generated data too, right? So there's even more of a need to dispose of stale data. The tool within Purview that handles this is called data lifecycle management, it's really like it says, the management of the lifecycle, right? So applying retention, deletion, so you can set, for example, expiration dates are once data reaches a certain age, whether it be last modified or from when it was created, to say once it reaches this age, I want to automatically delete that data. You can obviously set different retention schedules for different services, different workloads. For example, likelihood is that you want some different retention and deletion schedule for Exchange versus SharePoint, OneDrive. But within the tool itself, you give the option to users to apply exceptions again, right? So just like other labels, you want to apply exceptions where maybe you give the option to users to be able to apply a retention label that maybe their OneDrive has a default like 1 year, 2 year retention and deletion, but they can specify this file is important. I want to keep this one for at least 10 years or indefinitely. But data lifecycle management is the tool in Purview that handles that governance of the life cycle of the data.
When you work at like larger companies and you start dealing with, more sensitive business, oftentimes litigation will happen, right? And so I think one of the questions I have is, if something happens with a legal path and you have to put a hold on a mailbox or a site or whatever. If there is a retention label applied already, let's say like you have a 3-year, a retention on all Exchange mailboxes, but someone gets sued and they say, okay, we need the CEO's email for legal hold. And does that legal hold overwrite the retention that's blindly applied?
Yes. So the concept is it's always longest retention wins. But the difference between legal hold and retention is that retention is done based on schedule or because of organizational policy or regulatory requirement, whereas a hold typically is related to some investigation or litigation of some sort, and a hold is indefinite. So the hold will be applied for as long as it's necessary for that investigation or litigation. And when the hold is lifted, it will revert back to whatever its original state was. Now, if you apply no retention, then the hold is lifted and the file, for example, the emails or files weren't deleted, they'll just sit there. If you have retention applied that has deletion at the end, let's say you have like a 5-year retention and delete at the end, but because that custodian's been on hold for 10 years, the data's not going to go anywhere because it's on hold. But at the end of that 10 years, it's lifted, will revert back to its original state, which would have been the 5-year and delete. So it will be deleted, right?
So all the things that were over 5 years would just, as soon as you lift the hold, they're gone.
Yep. But in answer to your question, yeah, hold will always win. But even if the data is retained for 5 years and then you lift the hold, the retention will win. So by default, we'll keep the data if it's on hold or retained, but then it will revert back to its original state.
I like that comment that you made. The longest retention policy will win out. So that's important. Yeah. So moving on kind of with the legal aspect, obviously we have tools within Purview to handle e-discovery. And I think what most people start with, and I'm going to kind of put these 2 points together and maybe you can kind of separate it out. I think what most people start with, especially if you're in like an E3 type licensing model, is they just use search. It's like, HR or legal will say, I need to find, the last 6 months of emails for this person. And by default, most practitioners, because maybe they're not familiar with the tool, they just default to search. And so maybe talk about what is within search and what you can do there, but then how is that different from like e-discovery specifically within kind of how Purview is set up?
Yeah, and we made some big changes to the e-discovery platform very recently, and we blended. So it used to be the case where we'd have e-discovery basic or standard e-discovery and then premium e-discovery. We really blended the two together a little bit, and the separation of features is done by a toggle in the case itself. But the difference between just a standard search and the e-discovery search is the ability to apply things like keywords, the searching, like the filtering capabilities that you can do with an e-discovery search, and the hold capabilities as well, that typically relate to some form of investigation or litigation, right? So the typical practice may be you go in, you create a hold because you know there's some investigation or litigation going on, you go and create a hold, then you can go and do a search for the user's mailbox and apply a date range, for example, right? So you can, the goal is that it's more location, but data source based, as opposed to a content search, which you have to go and find everything and then narrow it down. You can select an individual and it will pull in their mailbox and their OneDrive, for example, right? So it's much more tailored towards an investigation litigation as it relates to an individual and then their data sources or their data locations that apply to that individual, right? With the basic tool, like the standard e-discovery, you have pretty straightforward search, collection, and export capabilities. And then you can, the likelihood is that with this you can do the export and then put that into some downstream review tool of some sort. When we go into the advanced stuff, you can do a lot more with the premium tool. I kind of geek out of it because not only do you have the two British people coming on the show, but you've got two people that have an e-discovery background. So that's my background. So I love deep diving into the e-discovery stuff, especially the premium tool. But that's the
So, what are your thoughts on working with legal firms? So, imagine I'm a company and I'm getting sued, and then I hire a team of lawyers to handle that litigation, right? But they need access to my data, right? They need access to my CEO's email, they need whatever. And so, I think again, what most practitioners, because they're not trained in how this all works, this is usually outside of like the standard defenders kind of toolbox, right? We just want to, it's high visibility. The company's getting sued. We got to get the stuff over there. So we do a search and then we export that, their entire mailbox of like 6 months, put it on a USB or CD, and we mail it over to them. And we're like, okay, here's the data. Is that how are you seeing it done? Is that the best way to get it done? Or is there a good way to like give those lawyers, because also lawyers are usually, I'm generalizing, but they may not be technical, right? And so like they just want to get the data and go on with their day. But like, is there a way to give them access? Is there an easy way to like give them data where it's at, rather than exporting your data and then just kind of shipping it off and hoping that they're good stewards of it?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways to do this, right? One of the key concepts of this is that everything in Microsoft Purview is RBAC based, right? So role-based access control, where you can separate the duties of users who are using the tool. So for example, you can give guest access to a reviewer or to those additional, these external parties, and say, we're going to give you access to the discovery tool, but we're not going to allow you to perform searches, so that you can't go and find data for people that aren't relevant to this case. We're going to create the searches for you, but you have the review capabilities. And this is more an advanced tool. With the standard tool, it's really just a case of the search, and then you can provide access of the export. But yeah, you can break it down to say you have limited access, and then they can download the data they want from their side locally, and then they have the data rather than having to download it yourself and then ship it. You can provide access to actually download. They can download the data themselves.
I see. Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. All right. So that kind of covers a lot of the basic tools within Purview. But there's a lot of really cool stuff when you get into like the advanced data protection, that there's stuff that's coming out all the time that like Adam and I have not really dived into technically. So let's talk about that. So once you have that, data discovery, you've started labeling, your users are trained on labeling themselves, you have that retention schedule, and everything's going. Now, what are some cool things that you can do to maybe automate that process and start to do things without user intervention?
Yeah, and I love talking about the advanced features because it's become so sophisticated over the last couple of years, and we've closed so many gaps with what was really relevant a few years ago. One of which being around so I started with like the identification piece before, so understanding your data. What we call advanced classification is where we can really get sophisticated in the way that we're looking for the content in the first place, right? So there are two main concepts that we call that regarding the advanced classification in Purview. One of which is trainable classifiers. So these are really powerful. These are machine learning models that you can train to understand your data, right? So for example, you might have files that contain social security numbers or credit card numbers, but that's because you know the fact that they contain a pattern that you can identify, and you can specify what the pattern looks like. There may be examples of files that don't contain necessarily like repeated content, but you need to be able to identify those types of documents, things like contracts, statements of work, right? Things that follow a particular style. So you can feed a custom model, hundreds of examples of what your data looks like. When that model is trained, you can deploy it to your environment. And just like if a file were to contain social security number or credit card number, if someone uploads an invoice or a contract that is trained by that model, again, the back end will say, this is a contract, right? And then again, you can apply protections, or you can apply auto labeling, which I'll go through in a second. The other one is exact data match. This has other industry terms, things like database fingerprinting, right? But essentially you can connect. This really works well for things like false positive mitigation, as well as dynamically looking for content, right? So you said about how do we do like that false positive mitigation? With the advanced classification, what we can do is point our classifiers to another database or another application, third-party application that contains structured data. So let's say you have a database that contains employee information or customer data, right? Or things I'm in the manufacturing use, so things like part names and numbers, right? As long as your other systems are kept up to date, you can schedule that feed into your classifier, and it's going to look for all those records within that other application or database for content in M365. If a file was uploaded or an email was sent that contains any data in that structured database, even one row, then again, automatically it's going to tag that file as containing that type of sensitive information, right? So we're looking for exact values, mitigating false positives, as well as dynamic looking for content. You don't need to keep your classifiers up to date as long as your other systems are kept up to date. That's from an identification standpoint, where we can start with the advanced stuff. And your question around getting into like the automatic protection is, again, now that we have our classification, we're recognizing where that data is. Now we can start leveraging the autonomy of the system to say, confidently, I'm mitigating false positives, I'm confidently finding where my sensitive data is. Now I want to start using the system to go and apply protection or apply labels with something called auto labeling. We spoke previously about manual labeling, where users can, under the sensitivity drop down, they can choose a label based on what they're creating. Now we can have the system actually say, because of the content in this file, automatically apply this label, right? So the onus is on the system rather than the user. There is a scale to that adoption. It can be daunting for people to think, oh, the system is going to go and apply all the labels and it's going to classify everything wrong. That's obviously the fear that everybody has. The stepping stone into that is to recommend labels to users. So this is actually what we do at Microsoft, where if you're still relying on the system to perform that scanning, that content identification, but rather than identifying and then applying the label itself, it recommends it. It recognizes there's sensitive information, and then it comes up with a banner that says, this file contains this sensitive information because the classification that we've set up. We recommend that you apply this label. So the onus is still on the user to apply the right label, but you're socializing that necessity to apply a protection. You're educating users on the fact that you need to protect this data using the classifiers that you set up.
Yeah, I like that. So that's actually part of the auto label policy, where you don't have to actually label it. You can just say, I just want to recommend. It's like rolling out a policy and audit, basically. And,
yeah.
But
Exactly,
you can still educate people, and they can still apply whatever label that they want. You just recommending it. Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah, there's really two concepts like the auto labeling piece, right? There's client side labeling, whereby when users are interacting with the file, so they create a Word document or an email, they start putting sensitive data in, or they paste sensitive data into an email, and then the label will automatically be applied or recommended to a user. That's what we call client side auto labeling. We also have service side auto labeling, where you can create a policy, point it to a repository or a mailbox, and have that automatically apply the label without any user interaction. So that's really useful, Adam, for your scenario. We have like existing data at rest. You can point a policy to that location and say, even if a user opens this file or not, all this data at rest, go and scan all these files. And if it contains this sensitive information, go and put the label on and apply that protection. That's the service side component of auto labeling.
Now, when you say client, obviously in this world, we have multiple different clients. We have Outlook on mobile, iOS, Android. We've got Mac clients. We've got web browsers. Obviously, Outlook in Windows as well. Multiple versions of Outlook, the new one and the legacy one too. So, how labeling and data protection and all that kind of work across all those clients?
Yeah, absolutely. It works based on the application. So as long as you have the Office application installed, so typically like Office M365 application, M365 apps, mobile, it's called like the M365 apps app. And it's sort of the same on other platforms, other operating systems. As long as you have those applications, everything is handled within those applications. All of the label application, the authorization is handled in the app. Yeah.
What about on-premises data? Because now I work with the federal government, and we still have quite a few on-premises, and unfortunately probably a few on-premise Exchange, on-premise SharePoint, maybe even on-premise OneDrive. I don't know. But anyway, so how does that work with kind of the hybrid model or modern information protection stack?
Yeah, and yeah, still have that conversation today, sometimes alarmingly, but yeah, we have something called the Microsoft Purview Information Protection Scanner, which is a tool that can scan on-prem repositories, right? So very much like the data classification service, it's like an extension, think of it as an extension of data classification and labeling to on-prem, right? So we can set up the scanner to be able to scan locations, and then we can actually automatically apply labels when it finds that content on-prem. So the extension to on-prem is very simply handled by that MPIP scanners. We love acronyms, obviously. So MPIP scanner is what that's called.
And that works with like just regular file shares too, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
SMB,
great.
NSF file shares. Yep.
Yeah.
File shares and on-premises SharePoint server, the two supported workloads in that. And that actually predates the service-side labeling by a lot. Because back when I was doing this, when I was an information protection technical specialist, we had the scanner and we had client-side labeling. And to do client-side labeling, you used to have to install an add-on to the Office apps. You had to install the AIP extension to make it work. And now today, that's all native. It's built into the code base for the M365 apps for enterprise. Word, Excel, PowerPoint, it's all baked in. And, actually amazing engineering fact on a side note, like Excel, that's the same code base on Mac OS, iOS, Android, and Windows. There's obviously differences for each platform, but the core code base is actually unified across every platform in which Office is shipped today. And so the engineering work they've done over in the Office apps is really quite incredible. And building all the native labeling into the applications, I was doing it for that transition as well. And that was a pretty big engineering lift too, but now it's just built in. You don't have to do anything to add that capability. It's part of the base code base. So if a user is signed in and they have labeling policies applied to them, they'll see the appropriate labels highlighted. If there's auto labeling policies assigned, those will fire. It's all way easier than it used to be for sure. So anyone's listening who has looked at this in the past and understood all the complexity with like, oh, well, the AIP extension only runs on Windows and it's an add-on and it's not built in and there's no answer for server-side labeling. Like, it's so far above and beyond what it used to be, where you have service-side labeling, you have client-side labeling, you have on-premises labeling. It's in every platform. It's on Mac OS, iOS, Android, Windows. It's built into the Office apps. The story has gotten so seamless and so good compared to where it used to be, where it was not too hard to kind of poke holes and find edge cases and gaps in coverage and everything else. And it's amazing the engineering effort that's gone into the Purview platform and all of this over the past 5, 6, 7 years since I started doing it. It's incredible.
We've taken that even further, Adam, recently. You made a good point about people find like the gaps and the edge cases. It's a huge, what was a huge gap and often not even seen as an edge case is what about protecting non-Office files and PDF files? Like, well, we can apply labels to Word, PowerPoint, Excel, PDFs, but what about everything else? Particularly in the manufacturing OU, we have image like AutoCAD drawings, things like that. We very recently announced something called Advanced Label-Based Protection, which is essentially the extension of being able to label encrypt files to non-Office files and PDF files. So we can now label what we call natively, whereby you apply the label and it keeps the extension, the original extension of the file, so that what you're referring to, like that AIP client, how it used to work was you'd have to probably people remember like right-click encrypt on a file, it would open up this AIP viewer client, and you'd have to select a label, and then it would create a P file. Mm-hmm. And then every time you wanted to open the file, you have to open the P file in the client, and it was just a long process. We've built the advanced label-based protection into the Windows operating system, or it uses the endpoint DLP, so the MDE, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint agent. So if it's going to be used on non-Windows devices, whereby we can automatically, we can apply the label to files now. So for example, like a DWG file, AutoCAD drawing, we can right-click encrypt, apply the label. It will retain its original extension, but still have that protection applied. If at any point it's copied elsewhere or uploaded somewhere, it's going to apply the restrictions of that label, right? So again, a big gap that we plugged is that non-Office files and PDF files use case very recently.
Interesting. So whoever applied that label, so it's going to retain the permissions of the label. So like if you create the label and it's like internal employees only, then how does it decrypt it? Is that still has to be on like a managed machine? Like if you encrypted something and it's internal only, how do I open it on my machine, unmanaged or managed?
Yeah. You mean for non-Office files, PDF files, or do you mean regular files?
Yeah.
So how it works is you apply, let's say I have a DWG file on my laptop. I apply the protection, and it says, it'll come up and say, okay, now DLP is now protecting this file. And I can work on that file. Every time I need to open the file, I don't need to go through the client. And then if I upload that file to the cloud, or I copy that file to USB, it creates that encrypted P file.
Okay.
So at the point of transmission, it creates the wrapper around the file. And then if, let's say I upload that to a cloud, and then you download that file, you open the file, because it's a P file with the viewer, and it says DLP is now applying the protection, it reverts back to its original extension, and it now still has those permissions applied. It still has the label applied. So there's like a one-time recognition of the fact that label, that advanced label-based protection is applied, and then it reverts back to its original extension and can be used, but it still has the protection applied.
But the decryption, does it have to happen because I have permissions to it? And like, where does the permissions get recognized? Is it upon download? Is it on my machine because I have MDE installed? Like how?
Yep. So yeah, when you configure a label, you set access controls within the label, i.e. encryption, right? So you can say, for example, let's say internal employees only. Let's say we have like a Microsoft internal, so only people who authenticate against that Microsoft.com domain can access that file, right? That label is applied to the file that I encrypt the file, the DWG file with that label, Microsoft internal employees only. I upload that to SharePoint. You then download that file, but it's a P file because I uploaded it. It was exfiltration. You download that file, and then you try and open that file with the viewer. The viewer recognizes that label is applied, and it's going to make sure that at that point, through the viewer, that you are authenticated against the Microsoft.com domain. If it passes that check, then you'll be able to remove the encryption, and then it will revert back to its original state. But if, for example, you were a non-Microsoft employee at that point, when you try and after downloading and opening it up through the viewer, then you'll be denied access.
Gotcha.
But it will always refer back to the labels and permissions.
Yeah. You said remove encryption. Just to be clear, the label and the protection retained, but I'm able to decrypt and see the file as long as I'm authenticated.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then if for somebody you were to copy that or move that elsewhere, then it would do the same process and encrypt, and then they would have to authenticate again.
Very cool. So, you're talking about like data transmission, uploading and downloading. I mean, that also can happen when, like your DLP policies are triggered whenever data is in transit like that. What else, when you talk about DLP, like in the advanced capabilities, what's kind of the cool thing in the things that Purview can do just beyond recognizing sensitive information types, and once you already have your data classified with these trainable classifiers, what else can we do with DLP as that last line of defense to help protect that data? Yeah,
the world of advanced DLP opens up so much when you go just past the basic capabilities, right? So with the best way to define what you get with like the E3 versus E5 for DLP is with DLP for E3 DLP based on DLP, you get DLP controls for Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive, right? So sharing emails, sending emails, sharing content from OneDrive and Exchange, OneDrive and SharePoint. When you go into advanced DLP is where you open up the ability to apply DLP controls to Teams, chat and channel messages, on-prem repositories or instances, so cloud applications, Fabric and Power BI, as well as endpoint DLP and Copilot too, right? So all of those, I think like 6 or 7 I mentioned, you can apply DLP now to all of those locations as well. That perimeter control can then be applied to all those locations. We could spend so long going through like what even just endpoint DLP does, right? So we use endpoint DLP for a lot of use cases from a DLP perspective. For example, as that mentioned, that scenario you mentioned before, where it was copied to USB, or they like just block USB. Maybe we were mentioning before. I don't know if we were talking about as we had started, but rather than saying just don't allow people to use USB, you say, okay, we're going to do content inspection to say you can use USB unless you're trying to use it, you've copied certain sensitive data, right? So you can say if it has this label applied, like confidential or highly confidential internal, that can't be copied to USB, but everything general or non-public, non-business information can be copied, right? So it's massive. It's because we're talking about data security. It's around doing content inspection to say, inspect the content, now we can allow those controls. For example, USB or upload to sensitive service domains, right? So we can say, we want a list of domains where, again, we're going to do content inspection to say you can upload non-sensitive data to your personal cloud or your personal email or third-party Gen AI websites. But as soon as you're trying to upload or copy and paste anything into these websites that contain sensitive information, we're going to block you from doing that. Right, so this is all handled through endpoint DLP. Typical use cases, ChatGPT. People are using ChatGPT so often these days, where you say have a policy that says, okay, we're not going to just block people from using ChatGPT. We're not going to unallow the use of it. But when people try to use it with sensitive data, if they try and paste or upload files that contain business information, that's where we're going to block that. So that's one of those components of endpoint DLP. Plays a huge part in our AI governance piece, right? So how we monitor like shadow AI and monitor third-party AI usage, we do that through endpoint DLP, right? That's a huge component of the endpoint DLP piece. So those other capabilities of DLP, things like on-prem DLP. The other one, big one that we've announced recently is M365 Copilot. So we can actually use DLP to say when you have labeled content, and soon to come, we're going to expand that to even just sensitive content. But right now, it's labeled content to say if it has these labels applied, don't let Copilot reference that. It's highly critical. Need to know basis only. Shouldn't be referencing the highly sensitive data because we don't want that returned in our results, right? So the big component around why Purview or data security is coming to the limelight is because of that, like a readiness for AI adoption. And that's one of those examples, right? Securing your data so that when AI is mining across all your corners of your environment for data, it's not going to access stuff it shouldn't, right? That's a key piece for the DLP piece.
What if I have access to that labeled content? Would Copilot still return that as results for me if I have access to it?
Okay. Yeah. So think of Copilot will just act on your behalf. So even though you may not be able to navigate and go find the SharePoint site yourself and find the file, if you have access to it, then Copilot can return that result for you, right? So it will always act on your behalf. It won't elevate your permissions, but
yeah, I love.
But Amren, I think, weren't you talking about a scenario like, let's say Andy works for KFC and he has access to the secret blend of herbs and spices, and it is, Colonel's recipe label. It's the most sensitive label in the company, and you tell Copilot you cannot reference the Colonel's recipe, anything labeled with that, no matter what. Would Andy still be able to access it in that scenario? Or is that what you were talking about, where you can say these labels are off limits, do not reference them, I don't care if you have access to them?
Yeah, so in that scenario, he would not have access because DLP is overriding the fact that, sure, you have access, but you can go and access it if you want to go and access it yourself, but specifically via Copilot, no, you're not going to be able to access any files that have that label that included.
Or like if I'm in finance and we label things pre-release earnings data, we may say that can't also, Copilot cannot reason over that. And even though I'm in finance and I could go open that Excel spreadsheet, it can't reason over that because we just don't want it reasoning over pre-release earnings data because it's so sensitive and such a regulatory risk kind of thing.
Correct. Yeah, it's
okay,
like
got it. Just want to unpack that a little more.
Right?
That makes a lot more sense. So you can, even if I have access to the data by going to this, like the spreadsheet or the source itself, you can tell Copilot not to return those as any indexed. And that's great, actually, because there's definitely scenarios where you don't want that to happen.
But I just gave two of them, right?
Yeah. Well, it was like the whole Delve situation, right? Mm-hmm. Like we brought out Delve and it was like everything was available, and it was like, well, that should not be returned. The mindset is that we're doing this securely now, right?
Well, I had to fight that Delve fight many years ago. You were giving me PTSD. Nightmares now because we had to explain no, that's shared. You have access to that. I mean, and all it did is it highlighted oversharing.
Yeah.
And then it kind of got quiet on that for years. Now Copilot came back out and now everyone's concerned about oversharing again. So, just like fashion, technology trends are cyclical as well, right?
Yeah, I do love that point that you put in there, Amren, about, blocking USB versus analyzing the data, and if it's sensitive or labeled, or encrypted on the fly or whatever it needs to do when that data traverses to a different plane, like a USB or uploading to a site. Because oftentimes the legacy thinking of security practitioners is, if it's scary and we're going to lose data, we're just going to go ahead and block it. But when you block USB, like organization wide, and I've been in organizations that have done this, the military, by default does this, it limits productivity, right? Because you do sometimes need that way to transfer data back and forth. And so when you talk about, let's do it this way and protect the data when it traverses, you can copy, a file that's a birthday flyer or something like that and send it over with no sensitive information. But if it's, the secret sauce, then we're going to protect it, encrypt it, and then no one else can open it. And that enables businesses rather than, like security is an enabler then, rather than we're the data police, right? And so you can't use USBs. We're just going to block it. You can't use AI because it's scary. We're just going to block it. But if you're using these controls, you can use it as long as you're not doing it with sensitive data.
Yeah, and we've taken that so far since then. Like these are really like basic kind of foundational concepts that we built into DLP a long time ago as well. We've taken that so much further with regards to, and maybe we'll talk about this, coming up around like the risk identification, like adaptive protection, where we use like risk-based controls, where it's slightly more restrictive based on rather than just the content, but other factors as well, right?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Like what is the risk-based stuff in adaptive protection in Purview?
Absolutely, yeah. So the user behavior analytics tool, or like the risk management, like risk identification, is called insider risk management within Purview, like one of the most sophisticated tools in the Purview suite. And essentially what it does is takes in signals and context of a lot more than just like a DLP event to build risk profiles for individuals. And then this is a full-blown investigative tool within it. But the use case I always like to go through for this is side by side of DLP. Okay, so inside risk management on its own doesn't do any like blocking. It's not going to analyze an event and then apply a block scenario. That's what DLP does, right? So let's say, for example, we have an individual who performs an action like copy to USB, you upload to ChatGPT or personal cloud, and what they do is they perform an event and they continuously, whether it be malicious or like inadvertent, they're in breach of policy, right? So they try and copy something sensitive to the USB, and it's blocked one day, and then they do the same thing again, or something else that triggers a policy in 2 weeks, and then they do the same thing again 2-3 weeks afterwards, and they continue to do things continuously over time, where this user presents some risk to the integrity of the data, the security of the data within the environment. With DLP, sometimes it can be difficult to correlate that risk to activity, right? So if you're a SOC analyst, you're reviewing alerts, one user triggers something every 2-3 weeks, every month, it's spread out a long period of time. It can be difficult to correlate that risk to that user activity. What inside of risk management does is every time an activity is undertaken by a user, it will assign a risk score to that user or to that activity. Okay, so for example, that same scenario, the first instance of a user performing that exfiltration of some sort, the risk is, and these are customizable thresholds, but it gives like a score of 10 out of 100. But then it will take into account the historical context of the user as well as the content, as well as things like, what's the norm for this user, because it uses AI. It can understand where the trends are, like what's normal activity for this user. We'll take into account a lot more signals and then accumulate the risk level for a user if they have historical evidence of performing a similar scenario. On event 1, maybe it's a 10 out of 100. The second time they do it, it might elevate to 20 out of 100, and then the third time like 40, until, again, these are completely customizable thresholds, until they reach a threshold of risk that you define. So let's say once a user performs activities in insider risk management, deems a user to be 70 out of 100, they're considered a high risk user. And once that happens, it will then pull in all of the information, i.e. the content that they were sharing, the activities that they were undertaking, into a console within insider risk management, and then actually put a plot on a user activity graphical representation of what the historical activity was, for you to perform an investigation into why is this user considered a high risk user. So as opposed to DLP, where it's an event and a block or a warn or an alert, inside of risk management is building a risk profile, scoring their risk out of 100, and then if they're of a certain level of risk, it will pull in that information, then you can investigate the risk based on that activity.
And, for practitioners within Microsoft Defender, they understand that risk profile, because already we have risk profiles for devices. We also have risk profiles for sign-ins and user risk from an identity standpoint. And those are able to be implemented into conditional access policies. And I believe that IRM signals can also now be leveraged within conditional access policies, correct?
Yeah, so this is the adaptive protection piece, right? So this is where now we take that content inspection block.usb, we can take that a step further and say, okay, now let's take those risk signals that is being generated by AI from inside of risk management, and let's take those signals and send them to other tools. So conditional access is one of those, as well as DLP, data lifecycle management, to say, okay, the really common use case is like a departing user, right? So someone's handing their resignation, and they're obviously going to be of significantly greater risk because they're leaving the organization. They're likely to steal data. A lot of people do that when they leave an organization. They take the photographic memory with them, as one of my colleagues used to put it. And what they do is, when they hand in their resignation, they're usually planning for that beforehand. They're copying data away, or they're sending stuff themselves, or they're stealing data before that event occurs. So with inside of risk management, that scenario where we can say, we can connect to an HR data system, so automatically to connect to a system that says, when a resignation is set in my HR system, automatically flag this user as a departing user, and it's going to monitor everything. But you can say they're a high risk user now, and it will go back and actually track the previous 90 days of activity to see if they need to be elevated before that. But they're now flagged as a high risk user because of they're resigning, or they've been exfiltrating data. So then we have DLP controls that lay dormant until a user is considered a high risk user. Then those policies become active for that user. So let's say, for example, I handed my resignation. I'm deemed a high risk user. Suddenly, DLP controls take effect that stop me from being able to upload sensitive information to my personal cloud, or any information, or copying any information to USB, right? So try and circumvent controls. Maybe I unlabel everything, or I change that, and then I try and label it. I try and send everything to USB. The AI is going to be smart enough to know that you're following sequences of activity that resemble exfiltration, like download, remove, or change label, copy to USB, is able to identify those sequences of activity and then implement more restrictive controls.
Wow. I think we're going to need like a part 2, Amren, because
Yeah,
this
we
is,
can go deep into this. Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot here, but we're kind of running out of time. I do want to touch on some of the newer things within Purview. Specifically, I think Adam and I have talked about data security posture management and data security posture management for AI. If you want to kind of give what you normally tell customers why that's important, and then I want to dive in just at the end on that DSI, which I believe is data security investigations, right? That's kind of the new thing within Purview. So let's talk about these last two things here, because I think that's pretty important.
Yeah. So DSPM, data security posture management, and then DSPM for AI are, again, newer tools within the Purview suite that really they bridge the gap of reporting across different tools. Right? So because we have so many tools that do so many things across Purview, we have an advantage where we can correlate these signals from the end to end of like the spectrum of user activity, as well as like the end to end, like the life cycle of data, as well as AI performing analysis on all of that information. We can aggregate the signals from all of those tools and then analyze what our data security posture, and use that to identify where there are gaps, how effective our data security program is, and then actually the system will provide recommendations on how to plug those gaps, and then we can see those continuous trends over time to see how our posture is improving. Right. So the big feedback that we've got over the years is that the reporting in Purview isn't as good as it should be. So DSPM and DSPM for AI is really a solution to be able to aggregate those signals and say, okay, where are the gaps? How are users using information? Where are there unlabeled and unsensitive or sensitive content that is unprotected, right? And then actually what we call policy recommendations. The AI will give recommendations into, here are scenarios that represent data that maybe is unprotected. Go and apply these specific policies and plug those gaps. DSPM for AI is really the same, very similar concept to DSPM, but specifically with an AI lens on everything. So all AI activity, whether it be Copilot, third-party AI activity with agents and apps as well, we can pull in those signals and see how users are using AI, which agents are interacting with sensitive data, with unprotected sensitive data, as well as addressing oversharing concerns. Right? So things like, we call it data risk assessments. We'll give you a report of all of the sites that have potentially overshared information for that readiness of adoption of AI. Yeah, in a nutshell, it's kind of the DSPM is like the overarching posture management assessment of how how good is your data security program and how is AI being used for DSPM for AI.
Yeah. So you could, I mean, even going back to the start, you could maybe even start with DSPM, right? And just look at the recommendations, because it'll give you an overview, right, of like what sensitive information types you have and where they're located and recommendations on labels and all of that, right?
Yeah, you can start there. It might be alarming because it will tell you, there'll be like a lot of alarms and whistles going off. But yeah, absolutely, it will tell you recommendations. It's a great starting point as well.
Okay, so what's this new shiny product here? This data security investigations.
Yeah, so yeah, DSI, data security investigation. So yeah, it is like the shiny new product within Purview. So it's a AI driven tool which really it's supposed to streamline an investigation into an event, like a breach or some incident of some sort. The way it does that is by taking a snapshot in time of, okay, let's say there's been an incident where there's been like a data breach of some sort, like some data has been leaked out, and you need to very quickly gain insight into who was involved, what data was leaked, where it was leaked to, and what any of the other information that was involved in this breach. It will pull in signals from the Defender portal as well as Purview as well as the audit log, and then once it pulls in that information, it will vectorize the search results to be reasoned over by AI and categorize all of that information from those other tools into buckets to streamline an investigation. So, for example, there's been a breach of some sort. You say, you like to know the data or some scope around what the breach was. Before you create an investigation, it will start returning relevant results, categorize them, and on the left in a pane, you may see things like credential data or specific type of data like financial data. And then you can use that to say, okay, well, I know my breach contained financial data. Click on financial data, and then it will pull everything in from those other tools and say, okay, these are the individuals that are involved with sending financial data. These are the locations that financial data was sent to and uploaded to, and then really just streamline an investigation into a breach and to help you narrow down an investigation into what occurred, what was the damage, what was the effect of that incident. Yeah, and the fact that it's AI driven in the background, it does a very good job of summarizing and generalizing and streamlining that investigation.
Yeah. So, and this is in the Purview admin portal, correct?
Yeah, it's in Purview. Right now it's in preview still. So I always have to caveat the fact that it's in preview and it may be subject to change of some sort. But yeah, right now it's a preview. If you have preview enabled, you can go and create an investigation. It does use security, the Copilot's SEUs. So the recommendation is to make sure you set limits to maybe one SEU or the limits as well, so that it's not just eating processes in the background. But yeah, you can go ahead and use that today.
Gotcha. Yeah, and
so let me just unpack that just a hair more. From everything else Amren has talked about today is included with user-based licenses as part of Microsoft 365. This one thing you just talked about, the data security investigations, that is a consumptive-based model. So does not rely on user-based licenses. Instead, it requires you to spin up what are known as security compute units, which are billed through your Azure subscription. And those are list price at $4 per hour if you pre-provision them. And Amren mentioned the overage units, where you can have it scale to how many you need to accomplish a given task. You can set a limit on the maximum amount you want it to spin up, and those are billed at $6 per hour. So really inexpensive, and a model where you can dip your toe in the water and try it out without making a long-term commitment, because you can use it for a couple hours, run a couple data security investigations, and if you're not seeing the value, you can turn it back off. So definitely something, if you want to check out and sounds intriguing, go and do that. The reason why it's built through that model is it's leveraging artificial intelligence compute, and that basically how much it needs can really depend on the complexity of your investigation and what you're trying to do. So just want to call that out, because we just recently did a whole bunch of licensing episodes, and also just want to clarify because it's a totally different model than everything else we just talked about to this point.
Yeah. So thank you for that, Adam.
Yeah, it's a great point.
This has been phenomenal. I've learned a ton, and I always do every time, like I remember sitting on customer conversations and you would explain things and you'd just do it in a great and clear way. And I would always learn something. I've learned something today. I think this was a much needed conversation for our listeners. And there's even more stuff that we had in our notes that we didn't get time to cover, but we're really unless they want to listen to a 2-hour episode, we're just going to have to probably have you come back on and talk more about some of this stuff.
Talk for that long, I don't think.
But yeah, thank you so much, Amren, for giving us your time on a Sunday.
Yeah, thank you guys.
This was phenomenal. So,
yeah, no, I appreciate the invite. Thank you for having me on the show, and happy 5-year anniversary.
Thank you.
Thank
to be
you
on it again at some point.
All right.
Absolutely.
All right, let me close out for everyone here. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information will be in the show notes. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about, we'll put Amren's contact information in there as well if you want to reach out to him, as well as some documentation on Purview and all the things that we talked about today. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.